Hello fellow 3D enthusiast, my name is Ian, and today I'm going to be sharing with you how you can make lava in Blender. And we're going to start in Eevee and do some real-time stuff, and hop into Cycles then and get a little bit more detailed with micro displacement, and then I'm going to show you how you can animate it. Before we get into the thick of it though, I'd like to tell you real quick about this free hydraulic kit bash element pack. So this pack is made for Blender users like yourself, and I created it so that you can quickly throw things together and get a nice result without having to spend a whole lot of time. So to get your hands on this, there's a link in the description, and you just follow that and you will have it momentarily. Right, so here I am in the Blender file, and I'm just going to walk you through the first iteration in Eevee, which is in real time. Looks like this. So there's three basic parts to this material. We've got the rock part, just sort of like hardened, cooled off magma. And then we've got the red hot part going on here. Pretty toasty looking. And then we've got the middle part, which actually mixes them together. So I'm just going to walk you through the shader here and show you all the parts that I have going. Before I do that, I'd just like to say I've got Node Wrangler enabled, which you can find in Preferences, Add-ons, and look up Node. There you go, right there. If you have that enabled, you can hit Control and Shift and click on a node and then view it. And that's what I'm going to be doing all throughout this, just so you're aware. So let's start with the rock. First of all, I have an image texture that's going into RGB curves, which just has the contrast bumped down quite a bit because it's kind of black looking. And that goes into my principled shader. Then I have that same texture going into a color ramp, which I have the whites turned up quite a bit. And that goes into the roughness of the principled shader. For the normal, I have this noise texture here, which I've set to 4D, and you can see this W value shows up when you set it to 4D, which we will be using later down the road when we're animating. And you can see the scale and detail and distortion. Distortion is really important when you're working with this kind of lava shape. If I turn it up, you can just sort of see what effect it has versus all the way down, it's just kind of boring. But I had that around 7.6-ish, which goes through a color ramp, and then I mix that with this texture here. So I've just got these two textures here. They're fairly simple. You can get them on textures.com, I think, for free. Now, I have this texture mixed together with the noise texture that I put a color ramp through, and then you get this texture, which is pretty nice looking. I fed that into the height input of a bump node and have the strength at about 0.8, and that goes into the normal on this principled rock shader, and you get this kind of crazy warpy goopy effect. So for the actual molten rock super hot stuff, I've got the same abstract texture that I had for the rock, and I'm just feeding that through a color ramp. And with the color ramp, I've got white hot on one side, which kind of goes to a bright yellow, orange, red, and then a dark red. And then that goes into the color input of this emission shader, which I've got completely pegged right now. You can see it's got this effect, kind of looks like the sun a bit. Now in the middle, I have this texture, which is mixing them together. The white parts are the white hot magma, and then the black parts are just the rock. And you can see I'm stealing this noise texture from before and multiplying that together with this texture that we have here, which is kind of a fun thing. I've got a basic noise texture going into the vector of a Voronoi texture, which I have set to 2D and distance to edge. If I cut that out, you can sort of see it's got this little tile kind of cracked effect. And when I put the factor into the vector, it goes absolutely bonkers. Then that goes through a color ramp, and once again, gets multiplied by this noise texture over here. Then we have this effect, and that goes right into the color ramp, which I use for the factor of the mix shader that mixes the rock and the magma together. The great thing about using this color ramp here is you can sort of change these values to end up getting a lot more of the red hotness or a lot less of it. It's really quite a bit of fun messing with those values and just sort of seeing what you get. So that's the Eevee real-time shader in a nutshell. And now we're going to switch into cycles. As you can see here, the transitions between the red hot and the rock are a little bit wonky looking. It's not terrible, and it'll work in a pinch, and it's great for real time. But let's go into cycles and add a bit more depth to it. Alright, so I'm in cycles here, and right off the bat you can see there's quite a bit of depth going on. I'm using micro displacement on this plane right now. And the cool thing about micro displacement is you can get really nice details close near the camera, and farther away from the camera where you can't see as well, the detail goes down a bit. So I'm going to show you real quick here how you can set that up. First of all, you can see we're in cycles. The feature set is set to experimental. And then in the modifiers, I have a subdivision surface modifier going, which I've checked adaptive on. In the material panel, down in settings, I've set this little surface and then displacement to be displacement only. And that changes it from bump to displacement, which actually adds in some mesh, which you can see getting displaced here. Alright, that's most of the boring settings. If we go into shading, you can see here our little shader has gotten a little bit more complicated. So what I've done to get the displacement is I've taken this mix node here of the image texture and the noise texture, mix those together, and that goes through an invert node now. Now this invert node is eventually mixed together with our original factor, and you can see this is leaning quite heavily towards the original factor, but we've got just a bit of this flavor of the rock texture. So with this mixed node, this is going to be our displacement. If we take a look here and go into material preview, you can see it looks like this. And with this, I'm just dropping it into a displacement node, which you can get by going to vector and displacement. But you'll see if we plug this into the displacement node I just got and plug that into our material output, when we take a look, you can see it looks like this, which is freaking awesome, but it's not exactly what we want. So what I've done here with the displacement node is I've set the mid-level to be about a 0.04, or 0 works just fine, and then the scale to a negative 0.2. If we plug that in, you can see it has the effect of making the lava elements kind of sink below the kind of harder plates of the surface, which is exactly what we want. So that's pretty much it with this stage. We've just got quite a bit more depth and detail going on, which will go a long way towards realism. So the next stage up is to animate it. And you can see here there's quite a bit more stuff going on. I've got this empty in the scene. I've got this timeline just so I can move it along. And in our shader here, you can see everything has a texture coordinate now. I've got this little network kind of going off into all my textures. Got the image textures hooked up and the noise texture here. This noise texture has a vector, and then the magma has a vector as well. So what is all this stuff? Well, if you have Node Wrangler enabled and you get a texture, you can hit Control-T, and that will just add in the texture coordinate node and the mapping node. With this texture coordinate, I've set that to be the object output going into our mapping node. And then for this little slot down here that says object, I set the empty to be our object. Now this is just sort of a spherical empty. You can find it in here. The shape doesn't really matter, but it's nice to have something to be able to select. And like I mentioned before, it is moving throughout the scene. I've just set this empty to be moving infinitely along the x-axis. In the layout tab, you can see I changed the timeline to be a graph editor, which you can find here, or hit Shift F6 it looks like. I've set a keyframe of location, and then down here, if you look at X location, there's a tab down here called modifiers. And I've just added in a generator modifier. The only thing I've changed with the generator modifier here is this little value. You can see it's set to, what was it, like a 0.01, and that just has some really gradual movement. By default, I think it's set to something like this, which you can see just kind of makes the empty book it off into the horizon. And since lava is moving slowly, we don't really want that. So yeah, 0.01 is probably what you'd want there. Additionally, if you want this lava to move on a different axis, there's the different axes in the drop down here. Just make sure you're adding the generator modifier to a different axis if you want it to go in a different direction. Okay, so that covers most of it. We've got the texture coordinates moving in a certain direction, and if we look at the material preview, if we just select a texture like this or something, you can see it's moving along slowly and happily. Now we have one more trick up our sleeve that will make this look quite a bit more like lava, and that is actually to animate the W value of this noise texture up here at the start. Animating a value like this is very simple. You just hover your mouse over the value at a certain point on the timeline and hit I. That'll add in a keyframe. Then head to another point, change the value, hit I. That'll add in another keyframe, and it'll go from one value to the other. So since this texture is affecting a whole lot of our shader, including the value that will mix the magma with just the boring rock, just animating that one value will affect quite a bit of our final material. If you look here, you can see it's nice and warpy. Now this is pretty much the end of the tutorial. One thing I'd like to make a note of is the micro displacement might not work quite so well if it is animated. I've had some problems with it in the past, kind of looking a little jarry and janky and kind of techno-y, which you might be going for, but usually lava will move a little bit more organically. But yeah, I'd say that's the end of the tutorial. Hope you found it helpful. Consider liking and subscribing, and I'll catch you again next week. Cheers!